World War One, the war to end all wars. We're going to be talking about this from, first of all, the larger perspective, which is, the world, basically Europe, and then we're going to try to bring it back sometimes to the United States and our role and how it affects us and all of that. You may have been taught this in high school, but I mean, I wasn't, but I learned it from someone a few years ago who had been taught this in high school. It's pretty clever. So if I were in the classroom with you guys now, I would write the acronym MAIN, Maine. Now, I don't have my PowerPoints in that order, but each one of those is going to represent one cause of the four major causes of World War One. Okay, MAIN. If you get your, get a notebook or something out and just, scratch those down, and then you can fill out each letter, and that'll help you remember the four major causes. Okay. So anyway, I start with I, imperialism, because this is the order I had them in before I knew that. But anyway, imperialism, we've talked about imperialism. We had the whole chapter on American imperialism. Remember, nation building, getting more land, and all, everything that goes with that. So we had something called the Scramble for Africa, sometimes called the Partition of Africa. The Scramble for Africa is going to be, it's going to be where you have Europe wanting, each one of the countries for the most part, wanting to gain, colonies. Imperialism again is all about gaining more land that wasn't originally part of your own whatever culture, or you're going out and you're expanding your territory. So the scramble for Africa, the race for Africa, the partition of Africa, whatever you want to call this, you're going to see the Europeans going into Africa. And we call this really the new imperialist period between the 1880s and 1914, when World War One actually does break out. Okay, so that's kind of all over the place. The United States is not going to really get into the scramble for Africa. And again, at that same time, it's the places that we've already talked about, like the Philippine Islands and Cuba and all of Puerto Rico, Guam, all the places that America was involved in somehow, moving toward or attempting to get an empire or whatever. Okay, so we're going to see during the late 19th century, you're going to have imperialism spreading. Okay, and there's going to be the disputes over Africa that are starting to pit European nations against each other. They also look down, Europeans looked kind of down their nose on Africa. They're like, oh, Africa, it's just kind of sitting there, and we need to give them civilization. We've talked about this in class, right? They believed that the civilization that was European based, basically white based, was the one that should be spread. We've talked about that a lot. Okay, you're going to see that in the United States. It's going to be justification for the Philippine War, et cetera, right? Spanish American War, for that matter, in some ways. But in general, you're going to see that it was a white European or European based responsibility to go down and take what they consider to be true civilization to a country that they saw as backward, okay, and undeveloped and in need of culture and civilization. So it turns out that that sounds like a, sort of a logical thing that people might think. Well, we've got the best of everything. We are obligated to share it. Okay, again, we've seen this before. Go back to your imperialist chapter, but in America. But what's happening here is Europe is going to benefit from going down there and taking Africa, because you're going to see that it's just like the United States when we were getting Puerto Rico, and then, of course, Hawaii, all the other things that we acquired. It is driven by the economy. It's driven by We're creating more products than we can sell. We want more places to sell our products, right? So you're going to see that the opening of the continent of Africa to the Westerners and to really where they start to come in and try to take over Africa is going to really start in the 1830s or so, and it's going to continue on again to the end of the century. And the Europeans had taken pretty much everything in Africa for the most part. There's only going to be a couple of countries by 1914, by the outbreak of World War I, that are still independent. Okay, and that's the picture that you're looking at here on your slide. You're going to see that the colors are there, you know, the Spaniards, the Belgians, the French, the Germans, and so on. But then you have a couple of gray areas. Okay, Liberia. Okay, Liberia, L-I-B. Anytime you hear that L-I-B, at the beginning of something, it's a reference to freedom, you know, things like liberty, etc., right? Liberia had started out as something that the United States pushed for, some of the members of Congress, for a slave colony. Once the slaves were going to be freed, they said, well, you know, maybe we should send them back to Africa, which was totally a wrong, wrong thought, because the generational slavery had been around since the 1600s, the perpetual slavery. So most of the slaves, by the time we get to the Civil War, had never been to Africa. But anyway, we end up with this little area, Liberia, okay, meaning freedom, basically, that started out as a former slave colony. Now we look over to the eastern part of the continent of Africa and we see Abyssinia, which is today called Ethiopia. And it's the other one that remained independent by 1914. Okay, so one reason for World War I, imperialism, scramble for Africa, nation, partition rather, nation building. The second one is nationalism. Okay, nationalism is something that we hear about today, and I ask you in class, I'm like, well, generally, does nationalism sound positive or negative? And I always try to make sure people know that nationalism, generally speaking, a lot of times has gone hand in hand with imperialism. But the problem with nationalism is, as I mentioned to you in class before, it is sort of a rabid patriotism. It's sort of it is a my country right or wrong. I mean, some kind of nationalism you could think about in terms of the cause of World War One, and in terms of the way it affected the world, is a nationalism that we see coming up every once in a while, since really, yeah, it started around the time of Napoleon, really in the late 1700s. We started to see a lot of rise for the first time of nationalism. But it's an identification with your own country, your nation, hence nationalism, and support for whatever your country does, okay? My country, right or wrong. Now, what that implies is that we don't care about the other countries, the other nations. We're only concerned with our own, whatever interest, our own, whatever's going to benefit us, right? So that's the type of nationalism we're talking about here. You see it again in World War II, okay? So each nation is going to regard itself as sovereign, no higher authority than themselves. That's going to be trouble. But if each one of them thinks that they are literally number one, it's going to play out really badly, and motivated by their own self-interest and success. Now you end up with this thing called brinksmanship. Now brinksmanship, good textbook definition is what I have on the slide. Policy and practice of, especially in international politics and foreign policy, pushing a dangerous situation to the brink of disaster, to the limits of safety, to get some kind of an outcome, because then if you win, If you're the one who forces the other guy to make concessions or to give in to you, then you have the other guy or the other country or whatever, you have them right where you want them. You can now negotiate from a point of power, right? So I always think of that as like a game of chicken where you have the old story, the guys that would drive their cars straight toward each other, for a head on collision. And the idea of the game was you didn't want to be the one that swerved. Okay, this is exactly what that is, only on a larger scale. You don't want to be the nation that, quote, chickens out, end quote, right? So that's going to be horrifically dangerous. And the second cause of World War One. So if we're looking at the acronym MAIN that I told you at the beginning, MAIN, okay, here's where the M comes from, militarism. Okay, and I always add popular militarism because this is going to involve the rampant nationalism too, because the people are really behind this idea. And someone was quoted as saying at the time, you're a historian, saying that Europe was armed to the teeth by the outbreak of World War One. Usually, when you're building up your military, you're building up your ammunition, you're building up your weaponry, you're getting training and stuff. Usually, you're preparing for war. Okay, you're not going to prepare for something you think there's no chance that's ever going to happen. So Europe was basically, they were actually preparing because they knew there was a danger on the horizon. Now, most of the European nations end up conscripting citizens, the men, okay, drafting or conscription into the military, except for Great Britain. And then again, you're going to see all these countries in Europe, almost down to a country almost, believing that they are going to be important and valuable only because of how strong their military is. Okay. Now, the standing armies of France and Germany are going to double in size between 1870 and 1914. That's incredible. Okay, doubling in size. Again, France and Germany are going to draft citizens. And then the Navy. Now, Great Britain is really big at having a Navy that is powerful. Remember, they're an island nation. And we talked about Admiral Mahan's book that Theodore Roosevelt read, talking about the influence of sea power on history. So again, Germany is going to compete with Great Britain, but Great Britain's always going to have a magnificent navy. Fourth cause of World War One, system of alliances. So by 1907, we're going to have the European powers kind of in what it says on the PowerPoint, two armed camps. This had all come about starting in the late 1800s when we had the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy as countries. And you're going to see that the way the Allies end up kind of shaking out by 1907 is different than one would have thought if you'd gone back a few decades. You would have seen that some of these weren't going to be actually very compatible allies. But by 1907, we're kind of stuck with what we've got, okay? So I need you to realize that we have the Triple Entente. That is what they were called in the peacetime. Before the war starts, we had an alliance between France, Great Britain, and Russia called the Triple Entente. When the war began, they became known as the Allies. Okay, remember that, memorize that, whatever you got to do. Now, the Triple Alliance was the peacetime alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Okay, now Italy is going to do a weird thing in both world wars. It's going to change sides in both world wars, but anyway. And eventually the Ottoman Empire is going to jump in there on the what they call the Central Powers when the war starts. So anyway, by this point, the system of alliances is going to make it really hard for any problem to be dealt with without dragging in other countries. Now, in class, I'll usually use an example and I'll say, okay, well, if you have, say, one of the kids, like I'll pick a student, I'll be like, okay, so Joe over here, Joe represents France, and Joe really does not like Bob over there. You remember Bob from our imaginary Bob from our class. So Joe and Bob don't like each other. So Joe is France and Bob is Germany. Okay, so if France and Germany had some kind of a um, conflict, the problem is with the system of alliances, France and Germany or Joe and Bob can't just figure it out themselves. They can't just deal with it, just the two of them, because they both, Joe and Bob, or France and Germany, they both have others behind them, backing them up, flexing behind them, right? That's what happens here. Okay. Once you'll see, as we're going to talk about how the war begins and progresses a little bit, much more in European history, but you're going to see that it's almost impossible for you to have two countries that could have dealt with it on their own without dragging in everybody else that's allied with them. Okay? Some of the countries, as I put on the PowerPoint, some of the countries may have stayed neutral, may have stayed out of it if it weren't for this system of alliances. And this is just a map showing you sort of where everything's located, you know, the triple entente, central powers, and neutral. Now remember, you've been hearing a lot, if you've been paying attention to the news about the virus and everything, the pandemic, you've heard people mention the Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu, one of the reasons why you end up with it called that is not because it originated in Spain. There's a little question as to where it originated. But the countries that were getting this horrible influenza back there in 1917, 1918, were at a world war. None of the countries want to really give out their information. Okay. So Spain is neutral and they're telling the rest of the world, you know, this is what's going on over here. So it becomes known as the Spanish flu. At least that's part of the story. So I thought it was worth mentioning since we're in the middle of a global pandemic at the moment too. This is just another map, just a different viewpoint, kind of pulled back a little bit so you can kind of see where things are. So there were four main big underlying reasons for World War One, but there's always a spark. I mean, think of it as you have a powder keg, you know, you have a bunch of gunpowder or something, and it sits there and doesn't bother anybody for 30, 40, 50 years, whatever. Somebody comes in and they light a match or lighter or candle or something, and it blows up. Okay, that's what I always refer to as the spark. Okay, because there were that many underlying problems, but something had to actually make it get violent. Okay, and this happened on June 28th, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Now, you need to know that date. It probably won't be that big of a deal for you, and it may or may not be on the test. But especially since all your exams are now going to be online, yeah, it's not as important maybe to sit down and memorize that date as it might have been before. Okay, so what happened was we had an independent country called Serbia, okay, made up of a particular ethnic group called the Serbs. They had been somehow they had been able to get their own independent country, their own sovereign nation. And the way that generally, we explain how that happened was the Russians backed the Serbs and helped them get their own nation, okay, which is aptly named Serbia. The Russians kind of considered themselves to be the big brother to the Serbs, kind of the protectors of the Serbs, because Serbia is not a world power, right? Now, you notice on this map, you have Serbia with the solid black lines around it. That shows that that's an independent country. Then you have Bosnia. Notice up to the west, the northwest of Serbia, we have this little dotted line. That area is called Bosnia. It was not a sovereign country. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as you notice. That's why it's got the dotted line instead of a solid line, showing you that it's actually a territory, but it's not independent. Okay. Now, the problem is the Serbs are an ethnic group, and there are many Serbs in the territory of Bosnia. They want their independence from the Austro Hungarian Empire. And so you're going to end up with a group we believe called the Black Hand that decided they wanted to commit an assassination. Okay. Now it turns out that that area down there, Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, all of that region down there, that's called the Balkans. And the Balkans is where you're going to see the heart of the beginning of World War One, with an assassination of a relatively small figure in the world. So the spark here is going to be that assassination. And when we talk about the Black Hand in this context, we're talking about a group of, we don't know exactly how many people, okay? They were extraordinarily secretive. They didn't really want to actually let anyone know how many of them there were, because they had gone out and they had committed, quite a few crimes. And the Black Hand, again, today we would call them a terrorist group, definitely. But they were angry, basically, whatever role they played in this. Again, that's still going to be a thing that historians sometimes debate, as to whether or not the members of the Black Hand were really involved as much as people have said they were. But anyway, what we've got is Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia, okay, and the Serbs believed that this was a terrible thing. As I said, the Serbs wanted to have freedom, whether they were in Serbia with their own independent rule, that governance, of themselves, or if they were in Bosnia. So that annexation had happened in about, I think it was 1908. But you're going to start to see that somehow the the younger, there was a group of youth over in Serbia that had determined they wanted to do something magnificent to show their disgust with the Austro-Hungarian overlords. And so you're going to have that going on. Okay, again, the youth of Serbia. And then you're going to have this other very, very secretive group. I mean, it started out with about 10 men or so, the Black Hand. And again, we don't know how many. We know that the main reason the Black Hand was formed was to get Bosnia to become a part of Serbia. So what we see here is that they're going to recruit some guys, okay, that can go in and assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and there's a picture on this PowerPoint on the right of Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. Okay, they're going to be assassinated that day. But he was going to become the king or the emperor of Austria-Hungary. Now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that's we can talk about their very, very complicated type of government. We talk about it in European history, but it's not necessary. Let's just say he was going to gain control after his uncle, I believe it was Franz Joseph, would have died at some point. Now, that's not the way it happens. He was going to be the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And the Black Hand, the guys that want the Serbia and Bosnia to merge together, they determined that they're going to kill him. So you had some young Bosnian Serbs. Again, remember, Serb is an ethnic term. It's not referencing specifically the country. It's an ethnic term. Okay. So they're going to take about 3 or 4 of these guys, and they're going to teach them bomb making, grenade throwing, marksmanship, and all sorts of things. Okay. And they're going to end up with several young men volunteering. Now you're going to end up with 7 guys the day of the assassination watching the parade, okay? And the fact that the Black Hand had been so secret about their members, it took quite a while for people to figure out that they had even played a part in this. Again, we don't know exactly all of the things that they did, but what we know is that that day when the assassination happened, we had 7 guys that were prepared to kill Franz Ferdinand. Now you had 3 of them who had gone to Sarajevo before Franz Ferdinand came, and then you have the others that are going to end up coming in a little bit later. Okay. Now Franz Ferdinand is going to go over to Bosnia, to Sarajevo, to inspect the military. Now, this is a visit that happens sometimes, okay? One of the roles of the Archduke, one of the things that he had as his position, responsibility, was to inspect the army. So it had been a while also since a prominent leader from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or anyone from one of the great royal families in that region, had made a visit to the region of Bosnia. Okay. Now it turned out that there were a lot of strange things going on that day. Turns out that during the visit, Sophie, his wife, was allowed to ride beside her husband. This was because it was their 14th wedding anniversary. Now, the reason that they had not been permitted to ride in the same car once they got to Austria was this weird thing because she was not of royal blood. So, when you talk about European history, it's all about your birth so many times. Are you born into a noble upper class family? And if you are, your name is going to carry you a lot longer than any wealth. Okay. So on June 28th, 1914, we know that the security was not really strong around Franz Ferdinand. He didn't really like security. He wanted to wave to the people. And to be honest, nobody was thinking that he was going to be assassinated that day. Okay. Sarajevo had policemen at work, but we don't really have him, Franz Ferdinand, and his wife with any particular protection. Okay. Now, what we saw is that about 10 a.m., Franz Ferdinand had been out there and inspected the troops and so on, and there were about 6 cars that were headed in towards City Hall, where they were going to go to this thing hosted by the mayor of the city of Sarajevo. So you have this procession, this basically this parade, and the day was nice, and crowds were lining there, the streets to cheer on Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie and all kinds of stuff. So as it gets closer, as the motorcade, as they call it, like with John F. Kennedy, we had the parade basically, but it's a motorcade. When they approached a group, the crowd would cheer and cheer and cheer. Now, the first guy in line who was trained in bomb throwing and all that, grenade throwing, bomb making, marksmanship, all of that stuff, he did not throw his grenade or his bomb. He said later there were too many women and children in the way. The next one, he took the bomb and he threw it directly at Franz Ferdinand. Now, it took just a few seconds, okay, when the car's owner, the guy who's driving it, he heard the bomb strike the lamppost where the second man, the assassin or the would-be assassin, had tried to break it open. Okay, he thought they had a flat tire, so they stop. Now, wait a minute. What we see here is the driver, not the owner, but the driver, said, "Oh no," and he actually guns it. He steps on the accelerator. So that means the bomb didn't land in Franz Ferdinand's car. Okay? Franz lifts up his arm because he sees whatever this is to deflect it away from his wife. And so the bomb is actually going to hit Ferdinand's arm as he knocks it sideways. It bounces off the car, and then it hits the car behind them with fragments, and it injures, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen or so people who were out there watching the parade. Okay. First and second cars are finally going to stop, and everyone's going to figure out what happened. Now, sorry, had a little technical difficulty there. Okay, so anyway, the one guy who had actually thrown the grenade or the bomb, he swallowed his cyanide. They all carried some poison with them just in case they um, got caught or were about to get caught or whatever. But the poison was old and it wasn't very effective. It made him throw up and all kinds of things. He had jumped in the river, and people just went over and just grabbed him, and he was arrested. Okay. Now the cars are going to continue on to the city hall, passing the other assassins because there were so many more. Now they thought maybe that the guy who had thrown the bomb had succeeded. Maybe that's why the assassin, or the would-be assassins, I'm sorry, the others, the other, what is that, 5 other ones, they just kind of left. They scattered to the winds, right? So Franz Ferdinand is going to be furious, okay? He is going to talk to the mayor, and he says, "Mr. Mayor, I came here for a visit and I was received by bombs. This is terrible." So then he finally was able to speak a little bit, let the mayor speak a little bit. See, the mayor, we're not sure. I mean, we're not sure if the mayor actually knew this had happened. I mean, it is 1914, and communications being what they were back then, we're not really sure if he even knew what had happened, because he seemed very shocked. And he basically just gives them one of his speeches where he's like, "Oh, we're so happy to have you here." Franz Ferdinand finally, after all of that, he's like, "Okay, thank you," to the mayor. And then what's going to happen next? Well, are we going to change the schedule for the Archduke? And he said, "Well, I still want to go and do a couple of things. Okay. I want to go to the museum he was scheduled to go to and visit, and I want to have lunch with the governor. But, I think that the rest of the schedule, maybe we could kind of shift around." So the same cars went out there, took off, and it seems like a very interesting thing to me. I've always thought that the driver in the first car, the mayor's driver, Franz Ferdinand's driver too, they really had not said anything about the change in schedule. Okay? Now, the problem with that is the guy who had gotten hurt when the bomb exploded, okay? You had a guy who had gotten I think it was on the back of his head. I think he got a bad injury. But anyway, that guy, his name was something like Marisi. I can't even pretend to speak, whatever, Marisi. But that guy would have been the one who would have actually been in charge of telling the drivers where to go. So the assassins, yeah, again, we didn't know what was going on. If we're those assassins, we're assuming that we are done. I mean, what's going on? Again, communication's not very good. So you have the assassin on the left side of your PowerPoint. you've got the guy Gavrilo Princip, and he's going to be walking around, in Sarajevo. Now, there's a couple of different accounts of this. One of them comes from the guy who was one of the security guards that ended up on the running board of Franz Ferdinand's car. See, and then there's other accounts of eyewitnesses. Some people say that Gavrilo Princip, the eventual assassin, was window shopping, just kind of looking around. Some people say that he had stopped and gotten a sandwich, and he came out and was sitting down at a table talking to someone. Whatever happened, okay, whatever happened, you're going to see the car that the mayor was in and Franz Ferdinand's car actually turning onto the exact street where the assassin was. Okay, now what we see is one of the generals is like, wait, what are we doing? We're supposed to go the other direction. The driver put on the brakes to back up. Franz Ferdinand's car was stopped directly in front of the store that, guess what? Gavrilo Princip was in, supposedly. Now, it's given, again, there's all these different accounts, okay? There's different accounts. There's different eyewitnesses who said it was, 5 feet away. He was sitting there with his sandwich and he just grabbed his pistol and just shot toward the car. There's others who say that it was 15 feet away and so on. But either way, Gavrilo Princip actually was right there in front of the guy he was supposed to be assassinating. And he does that very quickly. And they die very quickly. Franz Ferdinand was hit in the neck and he slumps over. And then Sophie was supposedly heard to say, "Oh my goodness, what are you doing?" And then she was hit in the stomach. Okay. And she was pregnant, by the way. So you're going to have the car then. Another thing that happened was the story of the car that it had kind of died. Okay. The car had died. And remember, this is 1914. And you really can't get the car moving. You have to go out around the front and you have to crank the car. So we hear from the guy on the running board that they probably both died within about 15 minutes. Okay, about 15 minutes. So you have Franz Ferdinand bleeding out, you have Sophie bleeding out, and again, there's the guy on the running board who keeps, this is his story, he keeps asking Franz Ferdinand, "How are you? How are you feeling? How are you feeling?" And Franz Ferdinand, even though he is literally actively dying, keeps saying that it is nothing, it is nothing. Okay, so check out what's going on after this. Okay, I have a kind of short version here where you have Austria then issuing an ultimatum to Serbia 3 weeks after the assassinations. Okay. Now, the reason they did this was because they wanted war. Okay. Austria wanted war because Bosnia, they felt, was getting out of control in trying to become a part of the Serbian independent nation and out of Austria's control. So Austria wanted war to resolve whatever is going on down there in Bosnia, and basically to crush Serbia because they find out, at least they think, that it's members of maybe even the Serbian government. That was what they thought at first, definitely, that were really involved in this assassination. Now, again, you're going to have in the Black Hand, you are going to have some some officers and some people in some high places and so on. But again, you're going to find that, sorry, I keep having to turn this one thing off. I'm really sorry. I know it's going to sound terrible. Okay. Anyway, um, they um, they want war. Austria-Hungary. Well, I just call it Austria from now on because it's easier. But Austria wants war. Now, here's what they do. Okay, 3 weeks after the murders, they tell the Serbian government, okay, Serbian government, you have to denounce loudly the aims and activities of the Bosnian Serbs. Okay, in other words, any of the Serbs, anybody associated with your government, anything, anybody, all of this, we want you to say how wrong it was of them to do it. Okay, that's easy, right? If something happened and someone's assassinated and your country or your allies or whatever were part of it, saying, yes, I am sorry this happened. That would be the easy part. Now, the part that I have in bold is they also wanted to allow Austrian officials to come into Serbia. Remember, Serbia is a sovereign nation, it is a country that governs itself. So the bold part is the part that Serbia cannot say yes to, because if they did, they would no longer be a sovereign nation. They would be, for all intents and purposes, under control of Austria or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, without going into too much detail, we've gone into a lot of detail already about European stuff, but you can take my class or Dr. Stern's class sometime on European history in this era if you want to. Great class. Dr. Stearns also has a class, it's History 120, that covers World War II only, which might be something that some of you would be really interested in. So, anyway, I'm going to try to cut back a little bit on some of the European stuff starting right here because we had to set up a foundation for what happened in World War I and it happened in Europe. So, right here we see that France and Germany are going to declare war on each other August 3rd, 1914. Great Britain declares war on Germany August 4th. And so, August 4th, all the great powers of Europe are at war. Remember, Russia thought of itself as the big brother of the Serbs, so they're going to come in and try to protect the Serbs. And it's just all the alliances are going to be at play at that moment. We've already mentioned the sides briefly. Just this is a repetition. You have the Allies um, that had been known as, before the war started, as the Triple Entente. Okay, the war starts, the guns start blasting in 1914 summer, and you're going to see them become known as the Allies. Okay, Italy is going to join. Remember, Italy started out on the other side. Okay, but in 1915, Italy joins the Allies. 1917, the United States joins, and as you'll see, we don't really send many troops for an entire year because we are in such bad shape as far as that goes, in terms of being prepared for a big war. Russia leaves because they're going to have the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution happening, so they're going to have to go and deal with their own issues. Okay, so again, the Allies used to be called the Triple Entente before the war. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy at first. Okay, that was the big alliance there. Italy, when they go over and go to the side of the Allies in 1915, Ottoman Empire comes in, Bulgaria comes in, and so on. But you're going to have the Central Powers. They were called, when it was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy in particular, they were called the Triple Alliance. This is the period before the World War broke out. So again, you're going to have your notes on your exams, so you don't have to do a lot of memorizing, and I know you're thankful for that. So if any of you are going to be history majors, or you may end up changing someday and becoming history majors, you never know. I started out and oh goodness, I could tell you how many majors I went through, but I won't even bore you with that. But if you're a history major at any point in your life, you're going to need to be aware of some of the great works of historians. And one book that everybody's going to need to know and to have read if you're a history major is The Guns of August. Okay, this is a very important book that was written by one of the few well-known female historians, particularly at the time she was writing. And this is going to be a Pulitzer Prize winning book. You don't need to know anything about it now except who wrote it and that it was about the outbreak of World War One. Okay, it starts out, if you're not very well acquainted with the kings and leaders in Europe in 1914, it might be a little confusing. It starts out with a funeral and it explains how they're all related, and all of them are cousins and all kinds of stuff. So I'm not suggesting you go out and read this book at any time in the near future unless you really are interested in history. But it is something you do need to realize is very important, and you need to know the name of it and just basically that it's about the start of World War One. So, as of 1912, we had a president. I think on one of the other narrations, these are a lot harder to do than standing up there talking to you guys in class because my ADHD, I'm having to sit still and I don't like this at all. But I am glad that we're getting to do it at least this way, where you can hear the lecture and ask questions. Send me emails on anything you have problems with. Anyway, election of 1912, I think I mentioned in passing on one of the other narrated PowerPoints, because 1912 was the election where you had Woodrow Wilson winning because basically the Republicans were split because Theodore Roosevelt himself came back, and good old TR, bless his heart, at that time he did not like his hand-picked choice to succeed him. He didn't really like what William Howard Taft was doing. So you're going to have Theodore Roosevelt going out, remember, and kind of running as the third party, remember, the Progressive Party, sometimes called the Bull Moose Party, and I told you that story. So the 1912 election, you're going to have Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, Theodore Roosevelt, who really was a Republican, but he was running on the third party ticket, and then William Howard Taft. Now the interesting thing about this is that all three of these men were either already men who had been president, like Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and then the other one is going to be the next president. So again, this was a crazy election. It was a nasty election, but we end up with Woodrow Wilson. Okay, Woodrow Wilson was the former, I believe, president of Princeton University. People with the United States having this anti-intellectual bent that we've talked about in class when we were still in person. And you can see it all around you today. People that don't seem to want to acknowledge science, or, as I said in class, if you were ever the smart kid that was embarrassed to say that you got 100 on the test when your friends were proud of getting a 70 or 80, okay. You've seen anti-intellectualism in America in action. Okay, Woodrow Wilson, president of Princeton University at some point, brilliant guy in many ways. But Woodrow Wilson came in there, and he came in just in 1912. He was inaugurated then, of course, in 1913, March. I think they were still doing it in March at that time. But anyway, he's going to come in at right before this great war is going to break out, and he's going to be our wartime president. He's going to get elected to a second term, okay, in 1916 because of the war. We don't like to elect someone different as our president historically if there's a big crisis or a big war, especially war going on, okay? Now, Wilson claims to be neutral, and he tells Americans to be neutral. I have a quote up there: be impartial in thought as well as in deed. In other words, don't do anything that shows which side you want to win the war. Be impartial. Don't even think anything about who you want to win the war. Now, that's impossible. That's impossible. And we see that Woodrow Wilson himself is on the side of Great Britain and the Allies. So you're going to see Americans unable to do what he said. You see him unable to do what he said. A lot of Americans are going to feel very angry to not the government of Germany in particular, but to the people of Germany, okay? It's going to stretch out. And, you're going to see that you have reports coming from all places that the Germans were doing all manner of horrific things. And you have Theodore Roosevelt, who still, until his death, is going to be a voice for the American people or to the American people. And he's going to say, as World War I is breaking out and so on, he's going to say something that is basically, he said something to the effect of, I paraphrase it, that there's no room for hyphenated Americans. There's no room for hyphenated Americans. Okay. Now, he's saying basically that you can't call yourself a German American, an Italian American, a whatever American. Okay. He says that our allegiance has to be to the United States. Okay. And we must be against anyone who holds any other allegiances. So that was Theodore Roosevelt's 2 cents on that. And you're going to find that Germans were treated really terrible in the United States. You're going to have German language newspapers shut down, or maybe they lost their advertisers, so they were forced out of business. You're going to have the German language that was taught in high school being taken out of many high schools. You're going to have people who are German speaking encouraged to stop, okay? Stop speaking German, okay? So it's going to be a real problem. Now, you're going to have men from German ethnicity, a German background, that are going to want to prove their loyalty to the United States. And so a lot of them are going to join the United States military. Now, you see that if they were German citizens at that particular time, they could still, if they were living in the United States, they could join the military. But you're going to have the Germans who had come over, they were required to sign a document renouncing citizenship to Germany. Now, a lot of people didn't believe that the Germans really renounced their citizenship. Okay. They didn't believe that they would stand with Americans. They believed that maybe in their hearts, these German men were still considered enemies by a lot of the Americans. So anti-German sentiment is at a fever pitch during the time of World War One. Okay. And as we know it's going to end up being really terrible even in other ways during World War II. Okay, so we'll watch for that. Germany's going to be the belligerent in both world wars, so that's going to also give Germany a unique position in the eyes of the world. Okay, another big thing that's happening. In May of 1915, we're going to see a British ocean liner that's sunk by a German U-boat, in other words, a German submarine. Okay, it's off the coast of Ireland, and we're going to see well over 1,000, almost 2,000 passengers and crew that are going to be killed in this terrible attack. Now, what had happened was the Germans, with their U-boats or their submarines, had decided that they were going to use unrestricted submarine warfare. And what that meant was basically that if they didn't know who you were, you're a ship out on the open sea, they're going to suspect that you're probably an enemy. Okay? Now, they had intelligence, they said, that the Lusitania was carrying munitions, supplies to the Allies. And the Germans said that's why they sank the Lusitania. So the Lusitania was the luxurious ship. It was a cruise liner, okay, and it's going from New York over to England. And you're going to see that because of the Germans and their declaration of unrestricted war, submarine warfare, that Germany had said, look, if you're neutral, we might attack the British ships. I mean, if you're over here in the Atlantic and we see definitely a British ship, it's an enemy ship. If we think you're working with the British, we will attack you if we believe we need to. So some people try to say that Lusitania was one of the causes for the United States getting into World War One, and it was not. Okay, that doesn't happen for about 2 more years, not until 1917. But with the Lusitania, you're going to see that we start to see Americans wondering if we're going to have to join that war, that European war. Because I'll tell you why. For one thing, there were 128 Americans who were killed on the Lusitania. Okay, 100 and, you know, any Americans killed on there. It was going to cause an international incident, but somehow we were able to avoid that for a couple of years. Now again, there were almost 2,000 people on board, okay, the ship who were killed. You're going to have something like 700 survivors, I think, something like that. And it turns out that the Lusitania is going to be, well, it's going to be one of those lessons, okay? The Germans said, we believe that ship is carrying supplies to the Allies. Okay, we believe it's carrying supplies. Well, it turns out that the Germans were right, okay? The Germans were right. The Lusitania was carrying tons of war ammunition, okay? Now, Germany eventually is going to apologize, but I mean, it seems like to me, I mean, this is my thought. I'm like, well, wait a minute. You had people on there, basically a cruise ship, and you've got tons of ammunition, shells, and I mean literal tons. We're talking something like, I don't know, 170, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, tons of ammunition going to Great Britain. In my opinion, what I've always thought is they're pretty much using the the passengers on there as human shields. Well, they're probably not going to strike a civilian, one that's carrying all these civilians, these passengers. It's a cruise ship for heaven's sake. But after the Lusitania, including the 128 United States citizens who were killed in this attack, you're going to see that although the American people start to get really upset and start to notice it, Woodrow Wilson is not quite ready for war. Okay. The Germans eventually apologize. Woodrow Wilson gets really rough with them. They apologize, but then by 1916, they're going to start unrestricted submarine warfare again. This is simply a picture of the cover of the New York Times, the lead story, above the fold story that day. Lusitania sunk by a submarine, and then they're guessing at how many people are dead, and giving some information there. So you can just look at that. This one is exactly what it said. This is a picture that was circulated widely in many newspapers in Europe and in the United States. Just because you need to see a German U-boat. There you go. There's a German submarine breaking water there. Okay, so after the Lusitania sunk, why is Woodrow Wilson not really ready to get into a war? Well, I mean, there's a big issue, first of all, about should we prepare? And there's a lot of people realizing that we probably should prepare just in case. I mean, it's really spreading in Europe, and I mean, everybody's at war. And do we really think we can sit over here in splendid isolation? No, that's probably not going to happen, right? So you've got that as the big issue. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, is going to say, of course we should prepare. Of course, you remember he's a war hawk. He wants war. He wants war. So he's saying, of course we should prepare. You've got William Jennings Bryan, who will come up again a couple times in this course. He's going to run for president a few times and so on. But you've got William Jennings Bryan saying, no way. We don't need to prepare for war. We're not going to get in any European war. Now, by the fall of 1915, again, this is several months after the Lusitania has been sunk, Wilson had to admit that he believed we should start preparing. Now, he goes out on a tour in early 1916, and he loved to go on these whistle stop tours, these train tours, okay? And he wants to see eye to eye, look people in the eye and talk to them about preparation, okay? So now that he has decided this is the direction we should go, he needs the American people on board. So Wilson goes out and he does a speaking tour. And I've always said, and this is ironic, I don't guess that's the right word, but it's interesting. We're doing this class now without me being able to look you in the eye. It's much better to look people in the eye and see what they seem to be reacting to as you speak. Sometimes you can see confusion, sometimes you see anger, sometimes you see annoyance, sometimes you see boredom, everything else. It works that way. It works that way too with politicians and people who are out there trying to get an idea of what the American people are thinking. So that's why it's very effective when you go and watch someone speak live. It's it's where you hear all the cheers at the rallies and so on. It's a very effective way to do it. So by mid 1916, we're already going to be preparing, and Wilson has got a lot of Americans over to his side regarding preparedness for war, just in case. So here comes our wartime election. Okay. Now the Republicans are going to nominate Charles Evans Hughes, who Theodore Roosevelt really supported. Okay. Now we think, according to some things he said, and also because of his support by Theodore Roosevelt, that Hughes was probably a guy who really wanted us to get into war. Now, Woodrow Wilson, of course, as the current president, is going to have the Democrat nomination, and he's going to win re-election partially by using a slogan. He kept us out of war. Now, what happened with that "he kept us out of war" slogan was, one of the stories goes that when they were at the Democratic National Convention that year picking the nominee and so on, and we know it's going to be the president usually for a party unless something really, really, really big is going on. And if we were in person, we could talk about the last time that happened and why. But anyway, you're going to have, usually it's going to be, the president's going to be his party's nominee. So when we hear the story that Woodrow Wilson, what he actually says happened was, when they were at the convention to pick the nominee, that he heard people chanting, "He kept us out of war." Now, he told the story and he said, well, I didn't tell him to use it. I didn't tell him not to use it. So, I mean, he's basically not taking any responsibility, for that. And Woodrow Wilson's going to win a narrow victory, really, in 1916 election, because also there were a lot of people that really didn't understand the need for preparation, even though a lot of people did. So 5 months later, after the election, is when we're going to declare war. Wait, let me make sure. December, January, February, March, April. Yeah, it was April. It was April of 1917. Okay. So what the slogan meant was, hey, it's implying that if he kept us out of war already, he's going to continue to keep us out of war. Now look at the electoral votes, okay? 277 for Wilson, 254 for Hughes. It's very close to the Electoral College. Look up there, and I believe, if I am not mistaken, the first time I remember seeing these blue and red maps frequently used was the election of 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and I see them all the time since then. And here's something to look at. Look at the electoral map and how each state voted. Okay, red is Republican, blue is Democrat. Now keep in mind, when you look at these maps, it looks like, wow, the whole country's Democrat. Well, you have to look a little deeper because you see, if you're paying close attention to where the red areas are, you've got some of the really populated areas. Okay, you have to beware. And that's how it is. A lot of times today, we'll see that with California and Texas, and then you'll see a lot of the rest of the map. Maybe you'll see the East Coast and some of the West Coast and some, but it's got to do with population, right? Remember the Electoral College. So all of that blue on that map, all of the Democrat voters, that's not a fair comparison if you're just looking at how many people voted and who they voted for. You have to understand that there's some very populous areas on the coast and, in some cases like Chicago and in the Midwest and so on. So keep that in mind as far as the election of, 1916, as far as the election of 2016, as far as any of the elections, pay attention to that. Also, before I move any further, I want to make sure to let you know also that I remind you quite often when we're in class that a lot of presidents have won by a plurality of the vote, which means, again, it's pretty close. So the Electoral College, some people argue, there's no reason for that, and some people, you know how it is. But look at, and I'll tell you, the electoral votes on there, the 277, 254, again, makes it look really close. You had Woodrow Wilson carrying a lot of states, okay, 30 states. Charles Evans Hughes carrying 18, but the popular vote was 9 million and something to 8 million and something. The percentages were like 49.2 for Wilson, 46.1 for Hughes. So again, that's not a particularly overwhelming support for the wartime president. We've talked about, say, President Grant when he went, got the 56% majority of votes back in, what was that, 1872, 3, 4, 5, 1876. You're going to see that most of these guys are going to end up with some kind of a plurality of the vote in many, many, many cases. Okay. Now, as far as the PowerPoint here that we're looking at, it's PowerPoint number 21. Okay. Again, Woodrow Wilson's going to say that he wants, and we need to have a war for democracy, a war to make the world safe for democracy. And he goes before Congress, eventually, and he's going to ask for a declaration of war in April of 1917. Now, his justification for war, we're gonna see that that's coming on the next slide. We're gonna see eventually why he really kind of has no choice. But Woodrow Wilson drew up something called the 14 points. Okay, 14 points. You may remember this from high school, you may not. But that was his peace plan. Okay, Woodrow Wilson has drawn up something called the 14 points. And that was his peace plan. Okay, now he wanted to have a lenient peace. He wanted to be easy on Europe because Wilson knew that whatever they did to Europe, if they were harsh on Europe, it would come back and hurt the United States. Remember, we're not living in a vacuum or in a bubble of any kind. Again, look at the way the pandemic is spreading and has spread throughout the world. Back then, we were not the most powerful nation in the world. We were a rising nation by a lot of accounts here. So what Woodrow Wilson puts in his 14 points is something called a League of Nations. That's going to be something that's to his detriment. He's not going to be able to get his 14 points. He's not going to be able to get all of this stuff put in place the way he wants to, as you will see later, because he refuses to give up on the idea of a League of Nations that were meant to be, or this League of Nations was meant to be, a peacekeeper. Okay, look over at the left when you've got the League of Nations portrayed in a contemporaneous comic. as a bunny rabbit. Oh, little bunny. And then look up there. The snake is going to come down and just take that bunny out because the snake represents international strife. So Americans are not going to feel really comfortable with giving up our sovereignty. You know how we've talked about Americans, we talked about the frontier thesis and individuality and all the things that make us unique. Well, we don't want to give up our sovereignty either. Now, you also see on the right, the comic from the time, you see Uncle Sam with his hands tied. And if you look at it, his hands are tied by the League of Nations. Okay. And you can read, what each one of them represents. So we feel as if we would be giving up our freedom, independence, sovereignty, and all of that if we accept that. Now, again, that's coming later. We're going to talk about that a little bit. What finally pulls us into World War I as a nation. Okay, so what happens is we're going to have a bunch of things that go on pretty quickly. We're going to have in January of 1917, the Germans are going to try one last assault on France, okay? And they're going to be blocked, by the British Navy. And then the Germans are going to renew their unrestricted submarine warfare, this time to include Americans, okay, American ships. Then we have the Zimmerman telegram. Zimmerman telegram, that was a thing that really got under the, really under the skin of a lot of Americans. And it was just really a ridiculous thing because this was a telegram that was intercepted by United States intelligence. And this telegram was a secret, it was a secret way of communicating between a high-ranking German official that wanted to communicate with a leader in Mexico. Okay. So what he was doing was he was proposing that, and by he, I mean the guy's name was Arthur Zimmerman. He was actually, I believe, the German foreign secretary. But he admitted that this was a true thing, once it was uncovered by intelligence. But the telegram said, hey, Germany and Mexico, we should work together. If the United States gets into the World War, then we'll give you back your land. Okay, the land that the Americans took from you, Mexico, we'll give you New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, maybe even some California, I don't know. So this was a pretty crazy thing. It was coded, as they did most things, of course, in those days. You're writing in code. And it was going to be sent, as I said, from the foreign officer, or one of the, again, one of the big foreign guys in Germany. He was the, what did I say he was? I forgot. The German foreign secretary, I think, is what his actual title was. But anyway, he's going to send that in January of 1917 to the German ambassador to Mexico. Okay, so he's pushing here. Okay, sending it to this ambassador to try to get the Mexican government on board to ally against the United States. Now, the way that it actually read, again, it said that Mexico could get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. But then it said that the details are left up to you. You meaning, the person who's receiving the telegram. It was the German ambassador to Mexico. His name was something Eckhart. He's not that important. But anyway, the idea was you're going to go and convince them to join us. So once we get that actual telegram intercepted and we get it decoded and whatever, the Americans are going to be very angry. See, the British are the ones that are actually going to intercept it. And at that time, it's because the transmission of telegrams of this sort at this time, from these particular places, was not going to happen because the British had cut the German international cables. Okay, so you're going to see there's a lot of, again, wartime things going on. And when we find out in the United States that this happened, then the Americans are going to become anti-Mexican as well as anti-German. Now, in Mexico, to be fair, there's going to be a lot of anti-American sentiment as well. Okay, so that whole thing, the Zimmerman telegram, plays a very important role in bringing the United States into the war, along with the submarine warfare, along with the last assault on France and so on. And then the Russians. Oh man, the Russians. The Russians are in the middle of the Bolshevik Revolution or the Communist Revolution, and they're going to have to leave. They're going to have to leave the Allies. And it's strange bedfellows, really, anyway, when we've got Great Britain, France, and Russia. Russia at the time was an empire. Okay, so the Russians, they had been a little bit strange for a fit with Great Britain and France, which were based on democratic principles more than anything. So the Russian Revolution, this is going to happen in 1917. It's going to start in 1917, and it's going to go on for a while, but it causes them to have to lead a whole different path, go a different path than the way they'd started out in the World War. Because what we see here in 1917 is the causes of the Russian Revolution were so varied. We had a lot of things like the people were scared because they didn't have enough food and supplies. And the Russians had really been suffering a lot of losses in the battles that they had participated in World War I to that point. Okay, so the Russians are going to have to do something different. Now, you also see that the Russians at that time, the Russian Empire, Imperial Russia, the emperor was Nicholas II of Russia, okay, and he's gotten a few previews of this Russian Revolution that would come out in 1917. Back in 1905, there was a smaller kind of revolt called Bloody Sunday and sorts of things. Nicholas II just was not a popular monarch, okay? So we have the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolsheviks were a revolutionary group, and they were committed to Marxism, okay? The Bolsheviks wanted Marxism. Now, Karl Marx, the idea is that if you can get away from the upper class, if you can actually do away with classes, okay, if you can do that, then we'll all be equal. We'll all share everything. So Marx himself, Karl Marx, who's writing in, I think the Communist Manifesto was written, I think, in 1848-ish, and then you have Das Kapital, his two big works. But Marxism, straight up Marxism, that is a form of socialism. It's the early form of socialism that we start to see emerging there in the 19th century. And Karl Marx believed that eventually Marxism, or socialism, his form of socialism, would evolve into something that he believed was better. He believed it would evolve into communism, okay? And that's a whole other animal which involves the government and so on. The idea of these followers of Karl Marx was that the proletariat, that's the name that they gave the workers in Marxism, okay? Marxists called the working class, the proletariat, okay? That the proletariat were going to rise up and overthrow the ruling class, in other words, the rich, the factory owners, and so on and so forth, right? So what we see is we end up with this revolution just ripping Russia apart, ripping them right out of World War I. And Russia's going to become a communist country from the time they finally end the revolution and everything, goes the way that that the Bolsheviks sort of wanted it to go for a while. But anyway, they're going to end up becoming the Soviet Union. eventually throughout my lifetime, from the late 60s up until 1989. They were the Soviet Union. Okay, so pay attention to that because Russia left only two allies, Great Britain and France. And that's going to also push us that direction as far as getting into the war. Now, three American ships were torpedoed under the unrestricted submarine warfare, and Wilson goes up before Congress and asks for that declaration of war April 2nd, 1917. Now, what he does is he goes before them and he says, so he said something like, I've called Congress into session because there's serious choices that I can't make. See, remember, it's the job of Congress to declare war, not the president, right? So he said something like that. And then he goes into some things, and this is where he's also going to talk about making the world safe for democracy in this speech. And he always, in this particular speech, if you were to read it, if you Google it, I'm sure you could find his speech to Congress in April of 1917 asking for war. But if you Google it and you actually read it, then he's going to be addressing Congress, asking them to declare war against Germany. Okay, and he's trying to be very solemn throughout this whole thing if you read it again. And he actually says somewhere in there in the speech that we have no ill feelings or something like this toward the German people. Okay, and they blame the government. He blames the government. It was the government. It wasn't the people's fault or whatever. Now remember, we've got a lot of anti-German sentiment going on already in in the United States by this point. So it's a little bit late to try to calm that down. And then he's gonna talk a little bit about the Austro-Hungarian government and how they have, by really doing nothing to stop the Germans, then they've shown that they're on in agreement and on the side of the Germans actually torpedoing whatever ships they want to. Okay, so um, he has a very emotional speech in front of Congress, and he says that it may be many months and sacrifice and so on. Now, one quote that I always remember, because I quote this in class every semester that I teach this particular class. Okay, one thing that he says that's straight from the speech, quote, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, with civilization itself appearing to be in the balance." Okay, and he says something then after that, like, it's more precious to have the rights than peace. We'll fight for the things that we've always held nearest to our hearts, and democracy. And then again, he goes on and ends pretty soon after that. But again, if you could read that speech, it's well worth your time to sit down and read that, because it's quite a magnificent speech. And Congress then, a few days later, gives an overwhelming support for our declaration of war against. What we're looking at here on slide number 23 is some Allied World War I recruiting posters. And in class, I usually say, okay, what word is rather prominent in all three of those? And I'll just tell you, it's the word you. Okay, they're trying to personalize this war. You, I'm telling you. Okay, Britons, you. Okay, God save the king. Your chums are fighting. Why aren't you? Okay, they're trying to bring this down to you, because this is the first really total war where they're expecting a lot from the civilians as well. Okay, and again, if you take European history, we talk a lot more about that too. Slide 24, this is just one piece of propaganda, I guess you could call it. But I mean, it's the wartime effort. It's an effort to keep Americans unified in this war. So if you read it, they're talking to the people, in particular in this one, to the men who were either too old or disabled, or maybe too even too young, maybe. But they want everyone to know that they're depending on people at home. Again, this one's aimed strictly at men from the way it's set up, but you're going to see other ones if you go and you even look for World War One posters. You're going to see that they aim them at children too. So, with your help, they are invincible. Without it, they are helpless. Okay, that one I think is a perfect example of how they're taking it down to the people, down to you and me, to the civilians, and giving us a role in this war. Slide 25, the American Expeditionary Force. Now, what we see if we go back and look at some things, you're going to realize probably some things that would surprise you. You're going to see that the United States did not really have a lot of troops in the service, okay, at that time. I mean, our numbers were really low, and you're going to see that we have to institute conscription. So by 1917, we don't really have a big army. Our army is pretty small. Okay. We really just had a standing army of about, yeah, somewhere around 120,000 soldiers. Okay. And about somewhere around 80,000. Now, sometimes those numbers, vary a little bit, but you really don't have a huge army in the United States at that point. Okay, as far as the strongest military and the biggest militaries, when you see the standing armies and you look at them and you say, okay, wait a minute, the I don't know, the Germans, for example, in World War One, Germans are going to have a much bigger military than the United States does, because we didn't think we needed that at the time. I mean, we certainly didn't want to institute the draft, but it gets to the point where we're going to have to. So if you look, you talk about standing armies. I mean, the Germans had, I believe, around the time of the beginning of the war, they already had over 4 or 5 million men serving, and they're going to end up sending something like, I don't know, it was like 11 million. Now, the United States, we were just pathetically behind. Well, what happens then is once we decide that we're going to draft young men into the military, we're going to end up with somewhere around 4 million men who have come in through the draft. Okay? Now, you're going to see several more that are going to volunteer, of course, because they want to help. But you're going to see also an interesting little piece here is the fact that this is the first time in American history that we had actually sent our troops to another country to go fight. Okay, so again, expeditionary, they're going on an expedition, right? They're going somewhere that's not on our soil. So it's really, I think World War One is pretty amazing in so many ways. My grandpa was actually, my mom's dad was actually in World War One, but he never ended up in Europe. He ended up in, oh, I can't remember where it was. It was stateside though. But the guys that are remembered in World War One, the leaders, you're going to have General Pershing. Okay, he's going to be the commander in chief of the American Expeditionary Force, and we're going to be sending them over there to what we call the Western Front. And if you're reading All Quiet on the Western Front at any point in your life, that's a good book to read. It's a firsthand account in novel form of a soldier who served in World War One. But anyway, we're going to send, so many military guys over there. And it's going to take a while because it takes almost a year for us to build up our military to the point where we can actually send large numbers over there. Once we get started, then that's what we're going to do is we're going to send, tens of thousands of men, just in big, big, big groups. but we have to get them first, right? So the draft and then volunteer. Now, this is the first time women are allowed to actually enlist in the Army, and it's the time when we're allowing black soldiers only in the Army and the Navy. Now, it's going to be a while before we have complete integration where we're bringing black and white soldiers, Marines and sailors and all the other branches, bringing them together, okay? But they're still going to be segregated in World War One. And it's not actually until, if I were in class, I would ask you if you knew this. It's not actually until after World War Two that the American Army is going to be completely segregated. At least, 1948, we have Harry Truman, who's going to be the one who's going to make that happen. But that's a ways off, okay, 1917. But we do have black soldiers in the Army and the Navy. Now, I will tell you, as time goes on, it's going to be the Marines that are the holdout, okay? As far as who's going to be the last group who will allow black men into their ranks, it's going to be the Marines who are last on that as far as that goes. Slide 26, you get to see a few pictures of the doughboys, okay, the American Expeditionary Force. And they were warned when they went over to Europe that, a lot of them were pretty naive. They're young, 18, 19 years old. And, most of the guys had never really been very far from home. And they're told to beware of foreign girls. Don't trust any of the foreign women. So they're going to use some techniques to try to keep their young men from getting involved with women in Europe while they're over there fighting. So a big problem was the rise of sexually transmitted diseases. And that's going to go up incredibly during World War One because we have all those young little boys over there heading out, where they've never been. And there's all kinds of other issues. But one thing that they focused on in the military was trying to make sure that they did not engage in sexual activity with these women in other countries, especially. Okay, I mean, we're going to have over there in the French and the Germans and some of the others, according to the military, the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea were the big ones, were just running rampant. And we see again that that is true. I mean, we saw a lot of the men who went over there who ended up with sexually transmitted diseases, and there weren't always that many ways to fight them back then. Remember, we're really in a position in 1914 to 1918 during World War One where we don't have antibiotics. We don't. There's so many things that we don't have, and there's all sorts of things that would happen because a lot of these guys too turns out were married and then they would come home and they would have the sexually transmitted disease that they might pass on then of course to their wives and so on. So there were some stories of men deliberately having sex with prostitutes they knew were infected. So it was a mess. So the picture that you're looking at, or the pictures that you're looking at on this slide, is you have, even if there's a girl who looks like a nice girl and she has a good reputation, don't sleep with her. It's dangerous. And on the one on the right, absolutely, whatever you do, avoid the prostitute. Okay, so again, this is the message that they got loud and clear, but you know what? For the most part, it didn't do any good because we see the numbers soar of these diseases. Okay, so we've got a year that it took for us to build up our troops, train our troops, draft enough people, have enough volunteers, all of that was going on. It took a while, it took a year. What we see too is President Wilson had appointed Major General John J. Pershing in May of 1917, right after the declaration of war. And John J. Pershing, who's sometimes called Blackjack Pershing, he was actually going to be in command for the entire war. And he was the one that made sure that we didn't send in a bunch of our military without enough training. That would be dangerous for them. And so that was his idea that, at least he gets a lot of credit for the idea of training these guys for a very long time before we sent many men over. Now, the American troops, the American Expeditionary Force, um, sometimes we call them doughboys, and they're going to be coming in. The very first ones are going to be in June of 1917. But really, we're not going to see anything going on at the front of the war, where the actual battle's happening, in particular on the Western fronts, what we're talking about, until sometime in October of 1917. Again, we've not got very many big um, numbers until 1918, about, April or so. So this picture to me is it's very sad. It's very interesting. But you need to know that even though we've used all sorts of weapons throughout history um, to hurt each other and so on, you can think of probably some as simple and deadly as throwing blankets that had been exposed to smallpox to the Native Americans or stuff, however that goes. But the first time that we really used chemical weapons in just an absolute massive way to kill or to harm people is going to be World War I. Okay. Now they're meant to kill, but they're also meant to sometimes just injure, make you feel really miserable, and you're going to have different types. Now, the different types, there were some that were just absolutely meant to kill you. Okay. There's some of the chemicals that, for example, chlorine. Okay. Chlorine, if you use chlorine as they did in World War I, you're going to be using it as a poison gas, and its properties, are similar to brine and iodine and all sorts of things. But chlorine, you need to know, if you're able to use that as a gas, it's gonna be nasty. It's gonna smell like, bleach. It's gonna bother your eyes, nose, lungs. Your lungs are gonna burn. And if you get a really heavy dose of chlorine gas, then it will kill you because you won't be able to breathe. Okay, and it can damage all sorts of parts of your body. It's very painful again. Eyes, throat, lungs, nose, all sorts of things. So the Germans are going to introduce some poison gas and toxic smoke and everything. But they're going to do it, as I said, we're going to see this done on a just large scale. And this always makes me sad when I have to talk about it, because it's so ridiculous how we, um, I don't know, how we as humans do things like, mass destruction on each other and so on. But the big one that you hear a lot about in World War I was mustard gas. And this is going to be one that causes blisters, and the pain from mustard gas is horrific, they say, because if you are hit with mustard gas on your skin, then it can form large blisters. We all know, if you've ever had a blister, how painful just a little blister on your foot might be. Imagine them popping up all over your exposed skin. And it can also get into your lungs, and that's horrible pain. So there's there's going to be attacks. Poison gas is going to be used not just by the Germans. I mean, we're going to see the use of poison gas um, being a little bit more widespread than just the Germans. We're going to have the British kind of came up with their own gas warfare, and they're gonna not be nearly as, I guess, effective at the killing the enemy and so on. But again, the picture, as I said, makes me sad because you've got a drill here where you've got the mules that are wearing a mask, of sorts for a drill. And I'm thinking, depending on the type of gas, the masks that are on the mules are not going to be all that effective. I mean, it looks to me as if their eyes are pretty exposed and probably most of their bodies. But anyway, look at the date as well. Okay, look at the date, November 1918. Now, the war is going to end November 11th, 1918, the 11th month, the 11th hour, the 11th, it's going to be um, it's going to be the armistice that's going to come about in November of 1918, which is the ceasefire. And this picture, if it was indeed taken in November of 1918, I mean, we were almost done with this war. So we come in April of 1917 with the Declaration. Not until early spring-ish of 1918 do we have really a lot of troops. So the United States is going to join the Allies, of course, is going to join, or we're going to join Great Britain and France, and we're pushing back the Central Powers. And see, that happens pretty quickly because by July, then the Allies had begun an offensive once we get enough troops over there. And so now the Central Powers are on the retreat, right? They're on the defensive, and it's about to be over. So by November, the war is kind of, it's negotiating and diplomacy and the fact that the Allies are getting stronger and stronger. We're going to see that armistice. Again, it's the 11th month, the 11th day. I didn't say that last time, and the 11th hour that it was signed on. Okay. And a lot of people, a lot of guys that are out there in the field fighting, they don't know the armistice, the ceasefire has passed or has happened. So it's going to take a little bit of communication to make sure they know. But when they know the war has ended, there are celebrations out there on that battlefield like crazy. So, the Big Four, as they are sometimes called, and as they are sometimes called, the Council of Four is going to have, if you look at the picture on the slide, you're going to have over on the left David Lloyd George. He has two last names. It's one of those names like that. David Lloyd George, who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You have Vittorio Orlando, who is the Premier of Italy. You have George Clemenceau, the guy with the big jolly looking mustache. He's the Premier of France. And then you have the American President, Woodrow Wilson, in Versailles. Okay. Now, the big four, the four nations, the top allied powers and so on, are going to meet here and discuss what we do next. Okay. This happens in January of 1919, a couple months, a few weeks after you have seen the armistice. Now, we know about Woodrow Wilson. I mean, I've mentioned his 14 points and the idea that it should be lenient and that we should all kind of look out for each other and stop the countries, any country from getting so worked up or whatever that they're going to want to attack other countries. A peaceful way to do it was what he wanted. Now, David Lloyd George was going to be, again, he's going to be powerful guy in his own right. He's going to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and a lot of people said after they were, either eyewitnesses or right at the time, if you look at primary sources, that David Lloyd George really did not want to destroy the German economy. Okay. Now, the way that they were, some of them wanting to destroy the German economy, was something that had happened since at least the Greeks and the Romans. Paying reparations. If you were the loser in a war, okay, you had to pay the war debts. You had to pay the war debts of the victor. Okay. So Woodrow Wilson agrees. I mean, he agrees. He does not want to destroy the Central Powers economy, because he knows it's eventually going to hurt the world, and that's going to come over to us, and so on. Now, Vittorio Orlando, the Italian diplomat, the premier, um, he is going to be going to the peace conference, and his role is not necessarily as big as the others. Sometimes that's why we occasionally hear them called the big three. Sometimes they don't include Orlando when they talk about the peace, discussions here. But Orlando is going to come in and try to convince the Allies that Italy needs some more territory. Since they joined on the side of the Allies, give us some territory. Well, Woodrow Wilson said nope. The British said nope. The French said and so he left. Okay. Now, he returned a while later, but still, he's not going to have the power really that the other three men had. So again, you're going to hear sometimes this called the big three, and that's when they leave out the Italian Prime Minister Orlando. Okay. Now, the fourth one is the French premier, French statesman. This is going to be George Clemenceau. I'm sorry, my throat is really getting sore from all this like weather change and talking. I probably said that like 2 or 3 hours ago when I started like recording. But Clemenceau, he's going to be the one who goes leading, representing the French at the Paris Peace Conference, and he says that Germany must be disarmed. And he was never satisfied with the Treaty of Versailles. He was the one who really thought that Woodrow Wilson was being way too nice, okay, way too easy. Now, he had constantly said that the Treaty of Versailles should be something they signed, but you know what? As time went on, he wanted more and more punishment put on the belligerent, Germany. Okay? So the Allies, the big four that enter into that, they're going to be the ones that are going to end up deciding so many of the the pieces to this treaty. Now again, you're going to have Orlando being sometimes just kind of kicked out historically in there, but you do need to know he was there, and he did try to get some things done. He just wasn't very successful. Okay. This is the last slide on the first part of the Great War, World War One, and America. So really where we end with this is where we're going to continue on the next PowerPoint, which will be up, again, give me another, maybe 48 hours to get that one up, because I'm recording for all of the classes quite a lot, which again is why my throat sounds so bad. But I would much rather be there with you guys. Have I said that to you before? Yeah, I know. I've said it 100 times. I would much rather be there with you guys. But anyway, it cost the United States $32 billion, and had just a really, crushing effect on the economy. And we're going to see the creation of many different things that are going to shape the way we are going forward. Okay, you're going to see a creation of the War Industries Board. Well, the purpose of the War Industries Board was going to be to help, I don't know, coordinate, to work between the War Department and the Navy Department, okay? Because at that time, the Department of the Army, it was just called the War Department. And that was to help them regulate supplies and how they were going to purchase supplies. And that's going to be a very important thing that goes on in terms of what we end up with here, because the War Industries Board is going to have a really, trying to think what I'm trying to say, the best way to say this. They're going to have a very positive effect in some ways because they're going to be able to increase industrial production in the United States. But it turns out that because we ended up in the war really so late with all of our, the massive numbers of our American troops, that by the time the industrial production had started to increase and really starting to help our economy, most of the war materials that were produced through the War Industries Board's negotiations and so on were a little bit too late, okay? So in January of 1919, we're going to see that the War Industries Board was actually going to be decommissioned. It was going to be, kind of relieved of their duty. Okay, so pay attention to the narration here, even though sometimes I'm really tired when I'm doing these things. I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting you some info that you can take notes on and not just look at PowerPoints, because I do say more than just strictly what's on the PowerPoints. Anyway, if you have any questions, please let me know. If you have any trouble accessing any of the YouTube videos, with these PowerPoints, please let me know. And just, again, communicate with me anytime. Watch for the next one.